movement. You see, pushed by a teenage girl that they would never know her name. And so it's not so wild to think that she married this failed Confederate general, missing the use of his left arm and a right leg. And to say that handicaps are not completely limited, in 11 years of marriage, they went on to have 11 children. They built an extraordinary life together. But you see, the problem was, as I was doing research, this had nothing to do with the hood that people in Franklin had told me about. This was not the crazed, drug, alcoholic, petty, mean-spirited, murderous hood. This was not the man who had literally plotted against his generals and his men to punish them. This was simply a man who was over his head, who was probably too young to be doing what he was doing. And this was such a conflict. And so I went to the historians. You see, my book says novel on it. And so I went to the men who say that they're historians. And I sat down with Wiley Sword, and he's told the Laudanum story. Everyone knows the Laudanum story. You know, Hood was so pumped up on laudanum during the battle that he couldn't make clear decisions. The problem was, I couldn't find that story before about 1940. It didn't exist. Nobody ever said they came upon Hood and he was doubled over, or he was groggy, or he was in his tent and they couldn't get awakening. Nobody ever said that any of this, the stories of alcohol, the worst that could be said about him was said about by Sam Watkins, someone who I highly admire, someone who really knew conflict and war, who simply wrote, you know, he wasn't a very good general, but he was a good man. Good man. How could the man that I heard about, that Wiley Sword talked about, how could he be called a good man? You know, the truth is that he was that man that Sam Watkins was talking, that Wiley Sword was talking about. Sam Watkins would probably have sneaked into headquarters and tried to kill him, like the men who tried to assassinate Hitler. He was an evil man compared from about 1940 on. And so that was one of the things I wrestled with. When I sat down with Mr. Sword, I said, where does it come from? Where's the laudanum story come from? Where does this start? And over again, he said, there's really no reference to this. And so the Hood, as he was emerging through my writing, was more the Hood that when he was reinterred in Metairie and had 5 Confederate generals standing around his grave, that Beauregard said he was the best of all of us. Well, I don't think he was talking about him as a military man. I think he was talking about him as a man. And then it became strong to me that possibly I could write this. And then let's let you historians, let's let you all wrestle through it. Let's let you try to figure out. I mean, when Mr. Sword, when he finally started admitting that there was no reason, a record of him taking laudanum or being drunk, and he said, but it's only logical. And I said, no, it really isn't. He's on a horse within 6 weeks after losing his leg. He's writing friends, not believing that this is press, but writing friends and saying, it's amazing, I have no pains. I've gone to surgeons, they've told me it's a 50-50 thing. Some people have great pains, some people never have any pains. He clearly is the one that doesn't have the pains. But he said, but you have to remember Buck Preston. You know, he's so depressed because of the breakup. And I said, she breaks up in 6 months. If he could figure she was going to break up with him, I mean, she did have that pattern, so I mean, anyone that went out for their first time should have probably figured it out. But if she figured out she was going to break up with him, he surely should have figured out that Franklin was going to be the disaster. The truth is that when Mr. Sword got finished, she said, it just seems logical. But you're right, there is no record of this. And then I heard him get up the next day and make a speech, and he said, you know, he was pumped up on laudanum, he was drunk, and he was depressed over the breakup with Sally Preston. And I finally decided the difference between my book and his was I really did say novel on the cover. and he had chosen not to. But hopefully historians will reassess him. There is already a beginning of that by people like Eric Jacobson and others. Hopefully people will come to a point of understanding better who he was. I may not have the real hood, but I don't think anyone has so far. So why am I so obsessed with all of this? Because you see, I am obsessed with the concept that the Civil War really does matter. I'm convinced of it. I was speaking at Trinity College in Dublin this last year, and Ireland's a beautiful place. Trinity's a beautiful place. But if the immigration lines are longer coming into this country and then into Ireland, it's not because we have more arid, uninhabitable land. It's because of the American Civil War. The American Civil War isn't just important if your family fought for the North or for the South or was even freed from enslavement. The American Civil War is important if you came over from Ecuador last year. Because if you're throwing your lot with this country, if there's a thing that is important, good or bad about this country, it's all somehow tied up into the American Civil War. I was put on a panel with some prominent scholars. It was like scholars and me. And I was speaking, and we came to the end, and it was the curator of the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, and he said, what's the most important thing we face as we enter into the Sesquicentennial? And boy, they just lined up. The scholars on the right said it's all about states' rights, and the scholars on the left said it's all about slavery. And I said, I think the most important thing we face is whether or not the American Civil War is going to be relevant. Because if we lose this, then we're going to lose one of the most important things we have as a nation going for us, period. I mean that with all my heart. And that's why I'm obsessed with it. If we, with the Sesquicentennial, with you young people coming along, you have the opportunity to somehow not lose this and to bring it forth. We will be a changed nation. Right now, the American Civil War is going down that road toward the English Civil War into ancient history. The English Civil War had huge impact. I know that y'all that follow Bill know this. Huge impact. So much of what this country is about is based on the English Civil War. And yet, it has almost disappeared out of England. We can't let it happen here. I'm going to read one short passage, and I'm going to finish, and then let the real scholars talk. This is by a fictional character based on a real person named Zachariah Cashwell, and this is his preparation for battle before Franklin. The thing I'm about to say you might not understand unless you've been in war, but in those moments before a fight, if you were a smart man, you'd figure out a way to convince yourself that it didn't matter if you lived or you died. If you're safe in your house with your children running around underfoot and your fields that need to be worked, it's an impossible way of thinking unless you're sick or touched in the head. Of course it mattered if you lived or died. But if you went into a battle carrying what happened to you, you wouldn't be able to fight, even though you knew you were as likely to die as the next man, whether you cared or not. There wasn't any logic as to who got killed and who didn't, and it was better that your final thoughts not be of cowardice and regret. It was better not to care, to let yourself be swept up in the rush of men beside you, to drive forward into the smoke and fire with the knowledge that you had already beaten death. When you let yourself go like that, you could fight on and on. Everyone had their own ways of getting their mind right. We lingered there in the outskirts of Franklin, and I could see each of the men in my company going through their little rituals. There were two ways of getting ready. Most of the new men, unless they were unusually wise or strong-minded, went about tricking themselves into forgetting the possibility of death. One youngster in an almost clean uniform took a couple pieces of straw, stuck it in his hat, and began to loudly tell every joke he could remember, to no one in particular, as if everything would be all right if he could keep laughing right up until the bullet got him. A few people were listening, but that really wasn't the point. Other, younger ones, paced back and forth, hitting themselves in the chest, shaking their heads like bulls and cursing. These were the ones who were trying to make themselves so angry and riled up that they could run like they had blinders on and rush wherever someone pointed them without thinking about anything except for throttling something or somebody. Some of these boys picked up rocks and threw them as hard as they could and confused rabbits and squirrels and coveys of quail flushed out of their hiding places by our noise. I caught one mountain boy with stringy auburn hair and no shoes punching and kicking an old locust tree behind us. I yanked him around and sat him down before he hurt himself. Me and some of the other veterans, we had different ways. We'd all been in battle, and you couldn't go through such a thing more than a couple of times without it becoming impossible to forget death. The boy I joined up with 3 years before, my best friend from Fayetteville, he'd gotten a mini ball through the eye in Atlanta. In my dreams, I still see his pink-brown face thrown back on the ground, his mouth open and his crooked teeth bared, his straw blonde hair matted with blood. That, I never forgot about death. The way I prepared myself was to sit down on my pack, pick out a point in the horizon, and stare at it. This is what I did that day at Franklin. I stared and stared at what appeared to be a church steeple on the edge of town, just at the limits of my vision, and I took stock of my place in this world. My pa died young, and my ma ran off when I was 10. I didn't have a girl. I had no one to go back to. I was just a man, and even if I lived to be 100, I'd still be forgotten someday. Men die, that's how it is. I guess I would have prayed for my safety, but I didn't. I took a deep breath, stared at the steeple, and convinced myself I didn't matter in this world. I was an ant, a speck of dust, a forgotten memory. I was insignificant like everyone else, and it was this insignificance that made me strong. If my life was insignificant and my death meaningless, then I was free of this world, and I became the sole sovereign of my own world, a world in which one act of courage before death would be mine to keep forever. When they called us up to get in line again, this time for keeps, I was ready. Men dusted themselves off and tightened their belts and obsessively checked their cartridges and ammunition just in case. I stood there, staring forward, silent, looking out over the rolling hills, hearing the pop, pop, pop of the pickets firing their first shots, and thinking I could almost see around the bend of the earth if I looked hard enough. It was so pretty. The hills were glowing and soft-looking, and I saw a couple of the deer scatter out of the woods and leap across the field as we moved out. I could have seen myself living in that little town in front of me, in a proper house, under a different set of circumstances, in a different lifetime. Before we stepped off, I thought, I wonder why they chose this place for me to die. And that, finally, was my real strength. I knew I was going to die. I wasn't happy about it, but I felt relieved to know it. Thank you guys very much.
So those of you who have not had an opportunity to meet Robert, he will be over at the shop. And if you haven't had a chance to pick up his new book, A Separate Country, or The Widow of the South, we have copies on hand. And I'm sure I'll be happy to sign them for you. We're going to take a little extended break here. Our next speaker is Professor Timothy D. Johnson. Since Robert went over just a little bit, we'll give you guys at least a 15-minute break to use the restroom to get a bottle of water before we start our next presentation. Thank you.